Longtime Democratic politician Dan Glickman is out with a book on his career called Laughing at Myself: My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and at the Movies. He argues that humor was the key or a key to success in his career and developing strong relationships. Dan Glickman grew up in Kansas, represented the state in Congress from 1976 and for 9 terms. He started as a Republican, became a Democrat, and then became Bill Clinton's Secretary of Agriculture, where he made it a priority to eliminate the legacy of racism for Black farmers. He was also the head of the Washington office for the Motion Picture Association, a grandson of Jewish immigrants to the U.S., and I have to say this, my holiday family when I lived in Washington, D.C. When I was White House correspondent, I would go to Dan and Rhoda's house for all the big holidays. So Dan Glickman, thank you for your career, for your work, for being here, and for all the food you fed me.
And Jessica, there's still plenty more, I tell you. The refrigerator would be full if you came back, I promise you.
I believe it. Well, the title of your book is Laughing at Myself, and people can already tell you have a good sense of humor, and you say that your parents taught you to not take yourself too seriously, and you hope that your grandchildren learn to laugh as much as possible. We'll talk about the application of this to politics, but why did you want this message out in the world?
You know, I think we've become rather humorless, at least in politics. And I've noticed that self-deprecating humor is not a key ingredient anymore in most political biographies. Maybe people are nervous that if they say something funny, it will be politically incorrect and it will be on YouTube till the end of time, and therefore they might be hit in a campaign on it. But for whatever reason, making fun of yourself is not viewed as an asset. And what I have found in my political life and others who I respect is that being funny authentically, self-deprecating, not Henny Youngman or Johnny Carson, but just kind of being yourself is a good way to diffuse difficult situations and get people to believe you and to follow your leadership skills. And if you look at our great or impactful presidents, from Lincoln to Reagan to Roosevelt to Kennedy, and there are others, almost all of them had this great sense of humor, natural sense of humor. And in that, they were able to pull the country along. And I think we need more of that.
Why do you think it's out of politics now? You mentioned political correctness, but would you elaborate on your analysis?
Well, I think that the 24-hour media has something to do with it. I think that the nature of money in politics, after all, there's this metastasis of money. That's all politicians are doing anymore, is raising money from morning to night. And most of that money goes into hostile, negative kinds of campaigning, not positive. I think that has a lot to do with it. And, a lot of people are afraid to they're insecure in engaging in what I call self-deprecating humor. They may think it makes them look weak. And I just don't think that's true at all.
I think of your career as an interesting lens through which we can understand a little bit about how politics has changed in this country. You started early as a Republican, you became a Democrat, you represented what we now think of as a red state as a Democrat, and you've thought of yourself, I think, as a centrist at a time the Democratic Party has moved to the left. Can we start with how has Washington changed since the time you got there in 1976?
Well, back in those prehistoric days, being a Democrat from Kansas, I had to be a centrist because while Kansas was a Republican state, it was not an excessively conservative state back then. And, a lot of our political leaders from Bob Dole and Nancy Kassebaum and others were not right-wing politicians. They were conservative mainstream politicians. But, my district was more Republican than Democrat. So to stay alive in that district, I had to use the football analogy, between the 40-yard line and the 40-yard line, and not between the end zone and the 20-yard line. And my constituents went along with that. And today, I think being in the middle is a kiss of death, or has become a kiss of death for most politicians. Now, this last infrastructure bill that Congress passed, maybe it's an example that things are kind of moving back, at least on some things, but I wouldn't take one piece of legislation and extrapolate it for everything else. But it was easier back then to be in the middle. Being in the middle is tough today.
What made it easy then?
One is that you looked like you were an independent force. People loved independent thinking. And so being in the middle kind of meant like, well, not that you didn't have strong views, but you were willing to listen. My mother used to say, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a simple reason. Remember that every day of your life. And listening, the art of listening is something we also don't do very much anymore, especially listening to people who have views different from yours. That's something that is a trait that we have kind of lost. So I would say that's perhaps one of the reasons why it's more difficult to kind of be a moderate in today's politics.
Would you explain what you said at the beginning, which is that there's more work that goes into getting things done than people realize?
Yeah, a lot of people think that nothing happens in our government. It's stuck. And to some extent, it is tougher than it used to be. For a lot of the reasons that I talked about before. But on many, many legislative items, people do work across the aisle with each other. And I see it all the time because I was at the Aspen Institute 10 years where I ran their congressional program. And Republicans and Democrats would agree on a lot of things. A lot of them weren't the most controversial of issues, but they were often the things that you could get things done. Now, when it came to the explosive polarizing issues, the social issues, abortion, guns, those kinds of things, we still have the divisions that are just as wide as they ever were.
And I think that is important for people to know that the big, big, sexy topics is where you see these explosions, but some of the more behind the scenes, boring stuff has plenty of bipartisan work, is what you're saying.
Yes, and a lot of the boring stuff actually impacts people's lives, how the Medicare program works, who's eligible for certain kinds of benefits. Those are the kinds of things that actually do get done all the time.
And that's important context. It's also true that we are living in a moment when many people on either side literally have no time for their opponents, right? Nancy Pelosi and McCarthy are not talking. Members of the Progressive Caucus in the House will not talk to the Freedom Caucus in the Republican Party. Is that a sign of democracy failing?
It's troubling. And part of that has to, again, go back to this issue of this metastasis of money. I must get 100 emails a week, maybe more, because I made some contributions in my life. Believe it or not, I even contributed to some Republicans in my life. But I made some contributions. So I'm on this list, and my email iPhone is just jammed. Google keeps telling me I need to expand the amount of space that I have. In part, it's because everybody's asking for money all the time, and that money goes for toxic or harmful kinds of things. That's certainly part of it. I don't know. I don't think the democracy is failing, but I think the extremes are louder than they used to be. And the other thing I worry about is this whole issue of the last election, where the people wouldn't certify the electoral votes, and then today when we talk about issues like should you get a vaccine or not, and the anti-vaxxers are out there, and sometimes I equate both of them kind of the same way, that an awful lot of people believe crazy things today, and that's not all the politicians' fault. Some of that is actually the people's fault. What's happened to what I call good political education? What's happened to civic education, where people understand how their government works and what is right and what is wrong, and what is a fact and what is a lie? Those things are tougher today than they used to be.
I think it's a separate conversation, but I attribute some of that to the collapse of the local media and trusted local sources of news. Yeah.
You're entirely right. My local paper, the Wichita Eagle, which barely exists today. It's like the inserts in USA Today for grocery shopping. But at its time, it was a powerful influence on my life. It had the highest penetration rate of any newspaper in the United States at the time that I was.
What does that mean?
That meant more people read that local newspaper per capita than any other paper in the country. Now, obviously, they didn't have the circulation of the New York Times and the LA Times, but in that community, people really read the paper. And that was true of local newspapers all over the country. Local TV still supplies a little bit of that, bringing people together in a sense of community. So people would read the local paper or watch the local news, and they'd get some national news out of that. And it wouldn't be as polarizing as a lot of the national media is today.
Yeah, it's a trusted common source of truth that people related to locally.
That's absolutely.
I'm curious, you've referred to money a few times, but what do you think are the root causes of the political division we see today? Is it gerrymandering? Is it just money? Is it the internet?
I think it's all of the above. And it's also the loss of trust in our institutions. I mean, people don't trust their government. When I see what's being said about Dr. Fauci and others who are talking about science and medicine and vaccines, not everybody, but a lot of people don't trust that. They don't trust their business institutions, and they don't. Fewer and fewer people are going to faith-based institutions that they trust. So the lack of trust in institutions has a lot to do with this. And it's worrisome to me because people need to have something they believe in and something that's based on truth and facts. And we really need to figure that one out.
I want to talk about your time as agriculture secretary. While you were in the cabinet, you made it a priority to eliminate the legacy of racism among Black farmers. You worked to increase farm loans to Black farmers, diversify the USDA workforce, and correct racial discrimination in farm lending. There was a more than $1 billion settlement. Would you tell us a little bit about that history, why you made that a priority, and what lessons you learned then that could be useful as we consider racial equity issues today?
This was a big part of my life as ag secretary. So when I was in Congress, I was on the Agriculture Committee for 18 years. We did not hold one hearing on the issue of Black farmers or minority farmers. And I don't recall on the committee that there was one African-American member of Congress on the entire Agriculture Committee while I was in Congress. So it was a white, largely Southern and Middle America committee. And so when I got to the Department of Agriculture, Jessica, there was a demonstration right in front of the department. I was actually sworn in. I went to the department, and there must have been 100 or 200 African-American farmers picketing me. And I'm saying, frankly, to myself, what the hell is this about? Because I didn't have any experience in it. But I began to realize and learn that there was a long history of discrimination by the Department of Agriculture and by employees of the department against Black farmers, basically since Reconstruction, but largely in the early 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And to some extent, it continues to today. And so President Clinton said to me, he said, fix it. He really didn't give me any guidance except fix it. And so we didn't totally fix it. I must tell you, but we at least raised the issue, settled some of the claims, tried to deal with the issue of systemic racism in the Department of Agriculture. And then my successors, especially Tom Vilsack, who's now the secretary, have also moved this issue along. But the history of race in America, to a large extent, had to do with large numbers of African-American farmers who were discriminated against, lost their farmland, and moved north into the big urban cities, and where they now live in much larger numbers. So the history of agriculture and race is very much a part of America.
What work is left to be done on that front?
Well, there are fewer African-American farmers than there were certainly 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 years ago. Of course, there are fewer smaller farmers generally of all colors and stripes than there were. So I think that the department needs to become more diverse, the USDA itself. It was often called the last plantation by outsiders who didn't like the way that we looked, because Lincoln called it the People's Department. But a lot of people said it became the last plantation. I mean, a lot of good people there. But I think that just the whole issue of consciousness of how to treat people with dignity and respect is just something that took longer to learn there than it did in other places.
Let's talk about your work with rural communities and your visits to rural areas. One of the reasons Trump won in 2016 was his success with rural voters who felt neglected. And you write that you think many Democrats neglect these areas. So how do you think Democrats should rethink their approach to rural politics, and how important is that?
Well, the first thing is to just show up. That has a lot to do with it. And then, and with all due respect, Hillary Clinton, I think she made a pit stop in Wisconsin and didn't stay very long there, so to speak. And then President Obama said that he wasn't totally talking about rural people, but he's talking about people clinging to their guns and their faith. And, those are bigger deals in smaller towns in rural America. And so a lot of it is just showing respect and showing up. And what I found in my life is, here I was, this Jewish guy, parents came from Belarus, didn't know anything about agriculture. I mean, they had to teach me the difference between wheat and corn. I knew the difference between a cow and a pig, but not a lot of other things. And I used to say I was the first Jewish Secretary of Agriculture since Joseph served the Pharaoh. So it had been a long time, in this thing. But I also learned from my dad and mother both. You got to show people respect. You got to listen to people. You got to look at the people. They don't necessarily have to agree with you. So to a large extent, not everybody, because we still elect Democrats in heartland areas in Congress, but it's become, to some extent, a wasteland of not very many Democrats, because I think they saw the votes in urban America. But just remember, every state has 2 senators. A lot of the states are rural states. We may not like the fact that Wyoming has 2 senators and California has 2 senators, but that's what the Constitution says. So you better pay attention to those people and their needs, and at least show them respect. It's not a question that Democrats and Republicans are better or worse on any of the agriculture issues. I mean, we pour a lot of money into farm programs, Democrats and Republicans. There's not a lot of difference between that. So it's much just showing that you're one of them, you care about them.
Do you think the world has changed so much that there are communities Democrats simply can't reach? And I'm sure vice versa. I think of Heidi Heitkamp, who was a very centrist Democrat, won for a minute in North Dakota, and then was axed. And Claire McCaskill, who had a similar political story. I mean, have we become so polarized that what you're describing, just show up, doesn't do it anymore?
It's tough. So let's look at Trump in Kansas. So Trump won Kansas by about 9 points. It wasn't a blowout like it was in a lot of other states, but it was maybe 10, 12 points. I forgot what it was. But when you go into the rural counties, sparsely populated counties, Trump won 10-1, 9-1, 8-1. Whereas in the cities, it was a little closer to that. So we do have a problem in terms of division in America, this rural-urban divide. And Democrats had better figure out how to speak to people in rural America and listen to them. And I don't think there's anything irrevocable about this. My guess is that you'll see the trend swing back to some degree. I don't think there's anything permanent about it. But there's no question, if you look at the map of the United States, it's pretty darn red in the middle and in rural areas and in small towns. And it's Heidi, you mentioned Heidi Heitkamp, but she and others like myself are doing our best to try to break that lockhold that Republicans have on rural areas.
I want to ask you about centrism, because you identify as a centrist. And right now there are these 2 centrist Democrats, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who inspire the wrath of many Democrats who feel that they're holding the party back from what's feasible. Why do you think the Manchins of the world are important?
Well, first of all, I know Joe Manchin. I don't know Kristen Sinema. She came in after I did, but Joe Manchin used to come on a lot of our Aspen trips, and I know him well. I'm glad they're there. I'm glad that there's not unanimity of thought in the Democratic Party, so that you can bring a different perspective, not tremendously different, but a different perspective on a lot of these issues. And I think that they tend to keep the party centered. I don't mean that politically, I mean that kind of emotionally. And they also want to do the right thing for the country as well. But I think it's healthy that you have different voices within the Democratic Party.
So what do you say to people who are Democrats and look at the Republicans and say, with the exception of infrastructure, which is a unique case because there's money to everybody's home state, so everyone's people are more motivated to do it. Right. But on most major issues, the Republican Party right now is in lockstep opposition to the Democrats, in the Senate for sure, right? And the Democrats say, well, now's the moment to take the majority that the Democrats have, tiny, tiny majority, and push through as much of the agenda as possible. And people like Manchin and Sinema are making that impossible, and that Democrats should be more like Republicans. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, and Harry Truman used to say, when a Republican runs against a Republican, I guarantee you a Republican will always win. it was kind of the story that he would talk about. But at the same time, to accomplish anything big in this country, it's got to be done in a bipartisan way. You just look historically, and Roosevelt found this out. Even at the beginning of the New Deal, it was really partisan, but then he couldn't get anything done for a while, and he had to work with Republicans. And so I think that, yeah, it is true that the Democrats have to have an agenda. It's very tight right now, but they are in the majority, and they've got to push their agenda through. But it cannot be successful in the long term unless there is some bipartisan support. Otherwise, it will not last.
You mentioned Harry Truman. Is it true that as a young man you drove around Harry Truman?
I didn't drive the car, my dad did, but we picked him up. We were in Wichita. We picked him up on the Kansas-Missouri border. He lived in Independence. And we brought him down to an Israel bond dinner in Wichita that my dad was the chairman of. I must have been 9 years old or 10 years old. It was in the early to mid 50s. And can you imagine, there wasn't even a Secret Service person with us. It was the former president of the United States who ended World War II. And then we got to Wichita, and he spoke to the bond dinner. I think we may have paid him $1,000. And then we drove him back, and there was a highway patrolman who drove with us. And first of all, I always loved this guy. I think he was one of the greatest presidents. I loved his name, Truman. I say to myself, he was the only president who had this extraordinary name that was pretty much like him. And he talked a little bit about, he said, watch out for this guy, Nixon. You got to be careful of him. I don't remember too much else, but I just remember the experience.
Hard turn, but the UN climate report was released this week, and it says that humans are to blame for climate change. Did you see signs of this when you were Ag Secretary? And how do you think this new report has ramifications for the agriculture industry?
No industry is more affected by climate change than agriculture because it's outside. And changing weather has an enormous amount to do with growing crops, whether they can survive pests, disease, drought, same thing with animals as well. So agriculture is beginning to see the impact of this in terms of these massive droughts in the West and fires around the world. And so the evidence is pretty clear that climate change is terrible for humans and for other living species. And it's particularly going to impact agriculture. So agriculture has got to become resilient, figuring out how to grow crops with less water. 70% of the water in the world is used for agriculture. 30% is for everything else. So we've got to figure out a lot of these issues. And I do think I saw this report, and it was alarmist, but I think it's basically true. And this is a scourge that we're going to have to work together on, and it can't be overly political or polarized.
I feel like it already is, but I think people are coming around. There is a song in the show Hamilton called "In the Room Where It Happened." And I think you've been in many rooms where it happened. Would you give us a story of one time you were in the room where something major was going down?
Well, I'll tell you this story that happened during the Monica Lewinsky situation. So, okay. So, this was after the president said that I did not have sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. And by the way, I love Bill Clinton. I thought he was a great president. He had a few defects, but he was a great president. We had a balanced budget, and he understood rural, urban. He kind of had it. He was a good old boy who understood the problems of the whole world. Okay, saying that, Monica Lewinsky happens, and the dress and everything else, and I won't go into great detail on all these things, but they brought in all of the members of the cabinet and the senior staff in the Yellow Oval upstairs to talk about it after Clinton kind of acknowledged the problem. And I called it the highest priced group therapy session in the history of the United States of America. And every member of the cabinet said what they thought. We went on the room like good and welfare, if you've ever been in a youth organization. And God forbid, I don't even remember what I said, but I'm sure it wasn't terribly profound. And the president and the vice president and Erskine Bowles were all there, and they gave their views. And some of the members of the cabinet were very, very pointed. Donna Shalala particularly basically said, "I'm extremely disappointed with you, Mr. President." I mean, I was like, I was shocked that anybody would tell the president. Usually you're very obsequious to a president. So, but any event, there wasn't a lot of reporting of this thing, and nobody quit the cabinet. I think the president did what he wanted to do, was to keep people in line. And I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall in that room, but I was in the room when it went on.
I bet that would go down very differently were it to happen in this era. I have a question out of that, which is something a lot of people are asking right now. How do you make the calculus whether it's worth keeping a politician in office who you think is a good, effective politician and aligns with your issues and values, but they have deplorable personal behavior? Should we look beyond a politician's deplorable personal behavior to keep the guy we like there or gal? Or are we living in a different era where it is sometimes right to say, no, how you behave matters, and that's enough to leave office?
I think how you behave does matter. It goes to your character as a leader. You got to show good character. After all, in this country, you have 330 million people, and your character will influence other people's behavior. That's the thing. And so, I mean, it's a question of how far on the scale you fall off, so to speak. I mean, nobody's perfect. I've made, a fair amount of mistakes in my life. Nothing like what you're seeing in today's environment. But, I haven't been perfect either. And so I would say that it's a judgment that the people have to make. And they're pretty good at the public. Pogo said, "We have met the public and he is us." And public is not stupid. Now, sometimes they can be misled, but on these kinds of things, usually if somebody's behavior is that bad, they'll be kicked out or they'll kick themselves out. And you've seen that recently, and we've seen it for a long time. The only time I have to tell you I didn't see it was in the Trump era, where Trump had such terrible character and was a bully and everything. And not only that, he wasn't a very good president on the merits. So he didn't have any of the qualities. Some people have the good, the bad, and the ugly. He just had, as far as I'm concerned, the bad and the ugly. And fortunately, the voters of this country made their decision. And so we don't have him to deal with anymore, at least in the White House.
Some Democrats are fretting about the Electoral College and what you referred to earlier as the fact that, these rural states with very few voters have as much of a say as population-dense places like California and Texas. Do you think our Constitution has sort of skewed our politics irretrievably? Would you like to see that process reformed? Should we add more senators in some states?
Well, I would get rid of the Electoral College. I mean, it's just crazy. Yes. I mean, the fact that now we're seeing the worst of it in terms of the challenging the electoral process in every state through non-factual reasons. Look, we ought to have a national popular vote for president. Now, I do believe that the Constitution gave the Senate the power with smaller states. And I know that irritates, the big states. So there's only so much you can do to change the country, and I don't think we need to add more congressmen and women, because the 435 is hard to manage. But I would get rid of the Electoral College. Absolutely, we ought to elect the president at large by the American people, and not using this crazy system of electors, which we used in 1787 or 1789, because they were there because people didn't trust the public to make the decision. So they have the electors to trust the public. Those times are past.
Do you think there's the political will to get that done? Do you think it's politically feasible to end the Electoral College?
Not now. I don't think that there are efforts to try to do that indirectly by saying there's a thing called a compact, where states would say that if the popular vote didn't equal the electoral vote, then those states would then change their votes, and it's a complicated process. But I think it's going to be very hard to amend the Constitution right now.
When you were elected from Kansas, you were elected as a Democrat in a moderate leaning red state. Then it went very red. And now there are signs of turning. There are some districts in which Democrats had upset wins for House seats. Do you think Kansas is going purple or even blue in the future?
Well, there's one Democratic member of Congress in Kansas out of 4, and Sharice Davids, and she represents the Kansas City metropolitan area, which is one of the higher income congressional districts in the country, and it's a moderate district. If I went, Bob Dole and I have become friends. After, we were always political allies, but we picked at each other politically over the years. And I once told him I was thinking about going back to Kansas and running, and he says, Glickman, you couldn't get 1,000 votes if you went back to Kansas and run. But he said, I'm not sure if I could get 2,000 votes myself. And so I think Kansas is still pretty red, but I do think that the redistricting process hopefully will produce more competitive districts, because the asset I had is my district was pretty even. So I had to be careful how I voted. And I didn't necessarily please everybody all the time, but I had to listen to different points of view, different perspectives. And when congressional districts are drawn so homogeneously, you don't have to listen to the other side. The primary is the whole battle, and the general election doesn't matter.
Such an important point. If you look out at the landscape going forward, what is the most important issue to you? What concerns you the most?
Well, there are a lot of issues. Climate concerns me. Just watching the fires, I'm just thinking to myself, is this earth going to burn up? James Baldwin, the author, wrote this book called The Fire Next Time, because it was based on the fact that God said to Noah, after the flood, I'll never do this flood again. And so Baldwin wrote a book called The Fire Next Time, because it's going to be the fire that's destroying the earth. I'm thinking, is that happening right now? But that's certainly a climate related issue, but there's certainly a lot of issues that I worry about. I worry that vast numbers of Americans still don't believe that they're part of our economic and political system. They're treated as second-class citizens, and this whole issue of inequality, it's not, it worries me, both racial inequality, but class inequality it's not healthy for our country. And, I have nothing against wealth. I wish I had more money than I do right now. But we have created a class in America, about 1%, that they own half the country. That's not a good way to keep a democracy flowing, to be honest with you. So, and I also want to see a strong and engaged America that doesn't disengage from the rest of the world. I think Biden is doing a good job. Trump really hurt us for a while in that regard, but I think we're on a better course now.
So you've had a very impressive and long career. What is your single proudest achievement?
Surviving in politics as long as I did, but also having an eclectic career. That is, I love being a member of Congress. You have all sorts of personal freedom, very little power, but lots of freedom. Then I had 6 years in the US cabinet. Just imagine, my grandfather coming from Belarus would have been shocked if he saw his grandson was the Secretary of Agriculture, not just the secretary, but agriculture. If I had been the secretary of the scrap iron business, he might have understood that. But anyway, there I had very little freedom, but lots of power, because I was able to, influence through the legislative process. And then I had this great period of time when I was in the motion picture industry, not as an actor, obviously, but as a lobbyist. But I learned the power and importance of culture, media, and movies, TV shows, entertainment, how important that is, and how it has made America very strong around the world, that our entertainment. Of course, my son, who I'm very proud of, is in that business right now. So I can't complain about, my career. And, the fact that I was this Jewish kid in the middle of America that was able to accomplish all these things, I think shows what the greatness of this country.
Well, Dan, Secretary Glickman, thank you for your public service, for sharing your perspective, and for all the food.
There's more here for you, Jessica. I'll just make sure it's properly cooked. Rhoda just walked in, so I'm sure she'll have you anytime.
Buy the book. Buy the book.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jessica Yellin. If you like this video, please click subscribe, and you can click the bell to get notifications when we post new content. Thanks for watching.